Welcome to video 4 of Gamer to Game Developer Series 1, and in this video we'll be implementing our multiplayer system. To achieve this, we'll be writing a multiplayer script, and this whole video is about that one script, and throughout this video we'll be implementing more and more functionality into that script. So I'll go on to describing how it'll work. So when the player starts a game, they'll be presented with a main window that'll appear in the middle of the screen, and the main window will allow them to do one of three things. They can set up a server, they can connect to a server, or they can just shut down the game if they're running a standalone copy. Now if the player chooses to set up a server, they'll click on a button, they'll be taken to a setup server window, and there after they set the server name and the port number, they can then create that server. And once the server is created and running, in the top left of the screen there'll be another window that'll allow them to shut down the server. Now instead, if the player had decided to connect to a server, they'll click on another button, they'll be taken to another window that'll allow them to enter an IP address, their player name, and the port number for that server. And then once they click the connect button and they're connected, when the player wishes, they can bring up another window to disconnect that from that server by pressing escape. So let's go on to seeing what those windows look like. So this is the main window, and it simply just has three buttons: set up a server, connect to a server, and exit prototype. So if the player was to select the set up a server button, they'll be taken to this window, the set up a server window, and here they can enter a name for their server, and they can enter the port number for the server. I'll just leave it at that if no other program is using it. And once they're done, they just simply say start my own server, and that'll just start up the server. And then the top left of their screen, at any time they can just shut down the server by hitting that button. And they can also see the number of players connected to their server. Now instead, if the player chose to connect to a server, they'll be taken to another window where they can enter a name for their player, they can enter the IP address of the server they want to connect to, and the port number. And once they're done, they just hit the connect button. And of course, at any time, I didn't mention that, at any time they can hit the go back button to be taken back to the main window. But if they click the connect button, they'll be put into the game, and if the player hits the escape key anytime while they're playing, this window will pop up, which will allow them to disconnect from the game. Or if they didn't want to disconnect, they can just press escape again and it'll disappear. Or they could click on return to game to make the window disappear. And it'll also show the ping of their connection. Okay, so I've explained how it works, how it works roughly. So now let's actually make our multiplayer script. So head on over to Unity and we'll create this new script. Okay, now that we're in Unity, let's create a new script, a new C# script, and call it MultiplayerScript. And then open it up in MonoDevelop. And we last were at the Blaster script, so let's just move over to the multiplayer script. And I'll just write some very brief comments that this script is attached to the multiplayer manager. We're just going to create an empty game object later and just name it multiplayer manager and drop the script into it. And it is the foundation for our multiplayer system. Alright, and then we'll start writing variables, and we have lots of variables to write in. So just follow along. I'll just first copy the variable start. And our first one is private string title message And the title message is going to be GTGD Series 1 Prototype. Our next variable, private string connect to IP is equal to 127.0.0.1. That's the IP address, our local IP address. Private int, an integer, connection port. $26,500 I've just chosen. Private bool use nat false. Private string IP address. Private string port. Private int number of players. And I'll allow our game to have up to 10 players. Public string player name. Public string server name. Public string server name for client. Private bool I want to set up a server is equal to false. And then private bool I want to connect to a server is also equal to false. Then the following variables will be used to define the window. So these variables are used to define the main window. So then private rect connection window rect, so means rectangle. Private, well, that's what I believe anyway. Private integer connection window width is equal to 400. That's how many pixels wide it will be. Private int connection window height is equal to 280 pixels. Private int button height, the height of our buttons, is equal to 60. Private int left indent. Private int top indent. I'll just save that. And now I'll make a new function. So I'll just go below these. Let's make some space. So void connect window int window ID. We'll be using this function to make our main window show up with the 3 buttons, so it'll have code in it that executes that. So I'll just put some parentheses, and inside it I'll just write the comment. Well, first thing, I'll leave a gap from the header at the top of the window. So I'll just write here, leave a gap from the header. And I'll use GUI layout dot space. I'll just use autocomplete, GUI layout dot space, and 15 pixel gap. Then the main bit of code. So I'll write the comment. When the player launches the game, they have the option to create a server or join a server. And the variables, I want to set up a server, and I want to connect to a server. Start as false, so that the player is presented with those buttons. So when we word that properly, so the player is presented with 2 buttons, set up my server and connect to a server. So now for the code, if I want to set up a server is equal to false, and so the 2 ampersand, I want to connect to a server is equal to false. So the player hasn't chosen anything at this stage, and that's what it would be when the game starts up for the first time. Then present to them the 3 buttons. So we'll enclose them inside an if statement. So if GUI layout dot button, and the text in that button will be, so what we're saying here is if the player presses this button, then execute the code within that if statement. So now we'll just define that button, like the text that's written on it, and I'll say set up a server is what the player should see on that button, and I'll set the height of the button manually. So when you use GUI layout, actually it'll automatically space everything for you. So you could put button after button after button, and it knows to just, it'll use a default setting for everything, but I want to actually specify the height of the button. So GUI layout dot height, and what is that height? It's button height, so that variable that we had assigned up there, right here, button height. And close it off. It's got 3 brackets to close off, and then give it parentheses. And so if the player clicks on this button, then what should happen? Then what I'll do is I'll set this bool to true. I want to set up a server to true. And you'll see, by the way, how this function will work. At the moment, it's not being accessed by anything, so nothing is making use of this code yet. But we will implement an inbuilt on GUI function, and in that we'll call this. So I want to set up a server is true. Okay, now let's leave a gap between this button and the next button. So I'll say GUI layout dot space 10 pixels. Now another if statement. So if GUI layout dot button connect to a server. So that's what will be written in this button. And I'll give it the height just like the other button, GUI layout dot height, button height. So if the player clicks on this button, then I want to set this bool I want to connect to a server to true. So later on we'll make use of these conditions. So if this condition is true, I want to set up a server, then that means that we should show that window that allows the player to set the parameters and then create a server. Whereas if the other bool, I want to connect to a server, is true, if that one is true, then instead we should show another window that allows the player to enter their player name, set the IP address that they want to connect to and the port number, and then connect to that server. So that's what we're doing here. We're just setting conditions. So I want to connect to a server is true. Set it to true. And finally the exit button. So GUI layout, but first a space, dot space, 10 pixels again, some even spacing. And this one, if application dot is web player is false and application dot is editor is false, then allow the following code to be executed. So I'm saying if the application running is not a web player and it's not what we're running in the editor, you know, when we're in the game mode, so if it's not either of the two, then what I want is for that third button, exit prototype, to appear and to function. So if GUI, so now if those two are false, then this button will be available. If GUI layout dot button exit prototype and the height of the button, GUI layout dot height, button height, and just close it all off and give parentheses, and within that simply application dot quit, and application dot quit will shut down that standalone game, and it only works for standalone. It doesn't work for the web player or the editor. So I'll just save my script so far. And now I'm going to add the onGUI function. Now this is not a function that we're making up. The connect window function is a window, a function that we've made up. But this one is an inbuilt one from Unity, just like the void update and void start. So this one is called void on GUI. So this is the code that should be executed for the GUI. Put in the parenthesis. So now I'll type the comments. If the player is disconnected, then run the connect window function. Whoops. So how do we check if the player is disconnected? Well, with the following code. So if network dot peer type is network peer type dot disconnected, then we can run that window. Now in order to run it, we also have to say where that window should appear, what is the size of it. So that's what we'll do right now. So I'll write the comments. Determine the position of the window based on the width and height of the screen. And the window will be placed in the middle of the screen. So here I'll define that variable left indent that we had written, and that was all the way back up here under the variables of the window, left indent. So this will mean how far away it is. It should be, the window should be positioned from the left side of the screen. So left indent is equal to screen dot width divided by 2. So the screen's width divided by 2 minus connection window width divided by 2. Actually, I shouldn't need that bracket there. And just close that. So what this will do is it'll take our screen width. So say it's, for example, 1600 pixels in width. It'll divide it by 2, so we'll get 800. And what did we say connection window width was? It was 400. So that'll happen is that'll get divided by 2 as well. It'll become 200. So 800 minus 200 will give us 600. So it'll say the left indent of our main window will be 600 units from the left side of the screen. So 600 units from the left side of the screen, so leave that much space, then start our window. And our window is 400 units wide, so 600 plus 400 is 1000, and that leaves another 600 from the end of the window to the right side of the screen. So that way we've placed our window horizontally in the middle of the screen. So the next one is to do top indent, to do the same sort of thing except place it vertically in the middle of the screen. So top indent is equal to screen dot height divided by 2 minus connection window, let me just keep typing that so I can see it better, window height divided by 2. Then we'll define that connection window rect. The actual, well, the way I think of it is the rectangle of the window. So we'll define that rect and tell it what its left indent is, what the top indent is, what the width of the window is going to be, and what the height of the window is going to be. So then it knows the shape of the window to draw. So connection window rect is equal to a new rect brackets. So now it's telling us the parameters it needs, the left, top, width, and height of that window. So left indent, top indent, connection window width. I'll just bring it down to the next line. Connection window height. And that defines our rect. And now we'll actually draw this window onto the screen, and we'll call this connect window function here. So to do that, we say connection window rect is GUI layout dot window. And what does it need? It first needs an ID number. So I'll just give 0. Then we have to give it the rect to draw, and that is connection window rect. the function that we want to run, which is connect window right there. That's the function, connect window. It's this function that we wrote, connect window. Just leave a gap there, just for tidiness. And taking it down to the next line, the last parameter I'll add is the title message, which will be displayed on the top of the window. And I'll close that and save our code. And let's go over to Unity now. So we've written just enough code to actually display that main window. It'll have no functionality, but at least we'll be able to see the buttons and what that first window looks like. So let's go back to Unity, create an empty game object. Oh, and you can see here a warning message down there. There'll be a bunch of them. It's telling us about variables that are not being used, and we will make use of them shortly. Yeah, but just at the moment they're empty. Well, I'm sorry, not empty, just not being utilized. So game object, create empty, and we'll call this multiplayer manager. So that's, I've spelled it correctly. Yes, multiplayer manager. Okay. And now I'll add our script to it. Script, MultiplayerScript. I'll save it. Let's save the scene. Let's run it and see what happens. Okay, so our window is appearing. Let me delete the player because we won't be making use of it till after we've edited the scripts on the player so that it will work in our multiplayer system. So I'm actually going to just delete the player from the hierarchy panel. Let me just check that the player, I've updated the player. So if you haven't, then don't forget to hit the apply button. And yes, it doesn't look like I have. So I should go back to the player and hit apply to save the changes I made to that player. And if I go back to the player and have a look, yes, the changes have been saved, so my prefab is saved, and it's okay for me to delete the player from the scene. Okay, so they're gone. Now let me just play it again. I'll save the scene and just play. And you can see that our window is actually appearing. It's appearing in the middle of the screen like we expected. There are two buttons. Since this is the editor, the third button is not appearing. So if we built this as a standalone game, it would be there. If we click the button, yes, nothing happens. Well, actually no, something did happen. Remember that those variables, I want to connect to a server and I want to set up a server? Well, they got set. So when I click the button, so I'll just stop playing and I'll start it again. So when I click this button, at the moment these two buttons are showing, remember, because those two bools are set to false. But if I click one of these buttons, one of the bools will go to true, and when that happens, the condition that both those bools are false is no longer true, so this window won't appear as we see it. So if I click on the connect to a server button, they disappear, which is exactly what we expect. So we've done this step, which is to set up our multiplayer script. Now we need to move on to the next step and start adding some more functionality so that we can actually set up a server. So I'll stop playing and move on. We've moved on to step 2 of 6, and we'll now add functionality to our setup a server button. Okay, we're back in MonoDevelop, and I'll add some more code to our void connect window. Oh, I just realized something. Forgotten to put in the variable's end here. Yes, I have to have it, so I'll copy that and paste it in. Okay, now going back to the connect window. Now at the end of this bit of code, I'll want to add some more new code so that we can make use of I want to set up a server. So at this point where we ended, let's go down and add a new if statement. So if I want to set up a server is true, and put parentheses, then I'll have the comment. The user can type a name, the name for their server into the text field. And how that'll look. GUI layout dot label, enter a name for your server. So the label is simply presenting that sentence here. Then we're going to, for our variable name, for our variable server name, which we had defined, let's see, back up here. Now we're going to say that server name is going to equal whatever the contents of the text field is. So we're going to say server name is equal to GUI layout dot text field server name. So then GUI layout dot space, and just give it a space of 5 pixels. So I'll add another comment now. The user can type in the port number for their server into the text field. So that's what we're going to do. We're going to have a text field for typing in the port number. And we defined the default value above. In the variables as 26,500. So now we'll have GUI layouts. We'll have another label. GUI layout dot label server port. Connection port, so that's a variable we had defined above, is equal to int dot parse, have a bracket, and then have another bracket, GUI layout. Actually, no, why would I put 2 brackets there anyway? Let me just remove that, sorry. So GUI layout dot text field connection port dot toString, and put a open and close bracket, and then just close off all the other brackets and put a semicolon. So let's see how well I can explain that. So what we're saying here is that this connection port, and let's go back up and see what the type of connection port is. It is an integer, so it's a number. It accepts numbers. And here, a text field is a string, and we're trying to assign a string into an integer type of variable. So what we're doing here is, first, we're saying that show in that text field, show in there the connection port number. So what our current default one is 26,500. But the text field needs a string. It can show strings, but so a number would need to be converted into a string. So that's what we're doing here. We're saying connection port dot toString, convert it to a string and display that in the text field. Now at the same time, we're saying that connection port is also equal to whatever the contents of that text field is. So if someone changes it to another number, so if a player changes it to say 31,000, well, what they would have typed in the text field is a string. So that string needs to be converted to an integer. So that's what we're doing here, int.parse. And then it can be taken into the connection port variable. So GUI layout dot space, and we'll give it 10 pixels. Now, after these two text fields and their labels, we'll now have a button that allows the player to actually start their own server. So if GUI layout dot button, and the contents of that button, it'll say start my own server, and the height, we'll just define a manual height. We'll say GUI layout dot height brackets, and I'll say that height is just 30 pixels, and just close that off, and then close the if statement and add parentheses. So now if the player clicks on the button, that means they want to start a server. So I'll put here a comment, create the server. Use the code network.initialize server. It needs to know how many players, so the number of connections allowable, number of players, the port to use, so connection port, and use NAT, and we just use NAT as false. I'm not really 100% sure what useNat is, so I won't try to explain it. I just know that for our purposes, we don't need it to be true. False is just fine. So back up here, I just said false. I could have just written false in there, I'm pretty sure, but I've used a variable. And I'll just close that. I'll end it with a semicolon. And we also want another thing to happen. So when the player clicks on this button, start my own server. So yes, first I want a server to be created. And at the same time, I also want the name that we gave to our server. I'd like to just save it. So we'll use player prefs. So for Windows users, player pref saves to the registry. So I'll just write the comment, save the server name using player prefs. So player prefs dot set string, the name is a string, so set string, and the key is server name. You can name this whatever you want. The key is simply how you'll be able to access this saved piece of information. So you could call it anything that you want, just remember what you called it, and then you can access it again using the key. So in this case, I just called it server name, and I want to save into the registry that server name. Okay, and now that I've done that, I also want to set that variable. I want to set up a server. I want to set it to false because we're done now. We've actually set up a server. So we're no longer trying to set one up. So we should set it to false. So that way, if the player shuts the server down, or, well, yes, when they shut the server down, they will be taken back to the main menu with the 3 buttons. If we didn't set it to false, then that window would still appear. It'll take them right back to actually setting up a server. So I want to set up a server is false. And I'll save my script so far. So now we need to add another button. So remember, we need a go back button so we can go back to the main menu if we don't actually want to set up a server. So if GUI layout dot button, and the content of that button will be go back, and its height will also be 30. GUI layout dot height 30. Close off all the brackets, parentheses, and say I want to set up a server is equal to false. So that'll very simply revert back to the previous window, since I want to set up a server will become false, and I want to connect to a server was already false anyway. So in on GUI, then this will start to, because of that function, this will start to this will go back to the main window, and we'll see these three buttons again. So let's go ahead and save the script. And before moving on though, we should add a bit more code, and which we'll add to our start function. So here we're setting our string for our server name. We're actually saving it into the registry, but we haven't actually loaded it anywhere. So the sensible place to load information that we've saved would be in the start function. Well, in this case of this script, that's what will make sense. So I'll actually first load up that string. So here we'll see how the get string works. So server name is equal to playerprefs dot get string, and we get it by using that key that we had made up. So server name, let me just check I've named that correctly. Yes, that's the key, server name. And I also want to add in a clause, because the first time that we launch the game, the first time ever a user uses this program, obviously there'll be no server name saved to their registry. So in that case, if nothing is saved, then just use a default word. So in this case, I'll use the default word server. So if server name is an empty string, so I just put 2 quotation marks next to each other, and that's an empty string. I'll put in parentheses. I'll simply say that server name is equal to server. So the very first time someone runs the program, when this script runs, it will look in the registry, it'll look for this key, and it'll turn up nothing, because nothing has ever been saved before. So in that case, server name will just be set to an empty string. And we don't want in the server name text field for nothing to appear. I'd at least like the word server to appear there. So let's save the script and head over to Unity. Okay. So now we should be able to set up a server. Let's give it a try, see what happens. So let's run it. Let's click on the set up a server button. And yes, we can see our label. So let me just bring up the code. Bring it side by side. Whoops. I'll just shrink that down. Well, not too much. Go back up a bit. Okay, now here we go. So you can see the first label here that's being presented. So when we had clicked on that I want to set up a server button, it set this bool to true, and while this bool is true, this function is being executed by the onGUI function. So while this bool is true, then draw this window such that there's a label, enter a name for your server, so you can see that there. The next thing is a text field, server name, and you can see there server is the default word that appears there. Now, let's see, did I actually? Yes, see, I didn't say anything. I didn't say that server name was server. So you can see that this bit of code in the start function worked. So it did try to load that key, that bit from player prefs. It found that there was nothing, and because of that, it just set the server name to equal server, and we see that appearing right here due to the Connect Windows code running. Then we can see, you can see the effect of the space there, that it just puts a little gap. The next label was server port, and we can see that being displayed. And our connection port, that text field showing the port number, we can see that there, 26,500 was the default port number that we're using. And after that, we can see the button. So if GUI layout.button start my own server, and we can see that very button there, it has a height of 30 pixels. If we were to click on it right now, this code would execute, but just before that, the next button is go back, and we can see that button as well. So I'll just go fully back to Unity, and just for the first thing, I'll just click the go back button. Okay, it is working. So I can then go back, I'll just click set up a server again. And you know, I'd like to give a name for our server. So I'll just say test server, and I'll click on start my own server. And yes, that's what would happen because we haven't written any further code. We are actually running as a server right now, though we can't tell that we are. There's, nothing visible whatsoever. And what we'll do next is to, will we do that next? No, we'll do that a bit later. But what we will do later is to have a window appear in the top left corner, and from that you'll be able to tell that you do have a server, and you can shut down your server. But we have most definitely set up a server. So I'll stop playing, and we've actually finished this step. So we'll move on to the next step, which is to allow us to connect to a server. And once we've done that one, then we'll actually add the functionality where we can see a window that allows to shut down the server, and then be able to, or if we're connected to a server, then be able to disconnect from that server. Okay, we're getting there. So we're on to step 3, and now we'll add functionality to the connect to a server button so that we can connect to a server. Okay, before we add the new code, I had noticed something, and that's I didn't put any comments for this bit of code in the start function. So I'll just add in there a simple comment, which is that load the last used server name from registry, and if the server name, oops, caps lock on there, if the server name is blank, then use server as a default name. Alright, we'll save that. And yes, now I'll add the new code. So inside the void connect window, so inside our connect window function, which is getting bigger and bigger, we're going to add, so just like we have here a bit, if I want to set up a server is true, we'll have another bit now for if I want to connect to a server is true. So at the very end of that, let's add in the new function. Oh, sorry, not the new function, the new if statement. If I want to connect to a server is true, then execute the following bit of code. GUI layout dot label, And this label should say enter your player name. And maybe it wouldn't be a bad idea if I actually I'll just finish that line. Maybe I should just refresh our memory of what the window looks like. So this was our connect to a server window. And this is what we're just adding right now, that label. And we'll have 3 labels. We'll have 3 text fields and 2 buttons. And of course, when we hit this connect button, we'll connect to any server that's available. Well, sorry, not any server that's available. The server, this IP address and port number. Alright, so let's just keep going. Player name is equal to GUI layout dot text field player name. So it's all just strings, so we didn't need to do any conversions like we did up here with the connection port. And then GUI layout dot space. And I'll leave a gap of 5. And you know, while I'm at it, I might as well add in the similar sorts of comments as well. So I guess back up here, it is fairly obvious, but I guess it's obvious because we're looking at the code right now. But maybe after a long time when we come back to it, by just having a simple comment there, we know immediately what that little bit of code is about. So simply the user can type their name, well, their player name, really, not their name, their player name into the text field. And for this one, we're now going to allow them to type in the IP address. So the player can type the IP address for the server that they want to connect to. Into the text field. So we'll add there a GUI layout.label, just like we were looking at earlier. .label to give the message, you know, server IP. And rather than just call it, you know, server IP, maybe I should say type in server IP or something more, slightly more descriptive. So type in server IP. And connect to IP. GUI layout. Dot text field. No, not a text area. Field. Connect to IP. And then a space again. GUI layout. Dot space. And 5 pixels. And next, we'll allow the player to type in the port number. So the player can type in the port number for the server they want to connect to. Into the text field. I'll just scroll down a bit. Alright. So GUI layout.label. Server port. connection port is equal to int.parse. So we're doing our conversion business again. GUI layout dot text field connection port, because .to string. So just like for what we had above for the server, once again we're having the same thing for if we want to connect to a server, we have to convert it. So that was just up here, connection port, we're doing exactly the same thing. So connection port is equal to int.parse. Oh yeah, so there, .to string, opening, closing bracket. So with this .to string, you always have to have this empty brackets here. Otherwise you'll get an error message. And just close off the other brackets and end the line. And then a space, GUI layout, dot space. And I'll leave 5 pixels. Okay, so we've actually now set up, or we've written the code to display our labels and the text fields. So the other two things were the buttons. So I'll just save what we've done so far. So we'll have a comment now. The player clicks on this button. Oh, whoops, I've got the forward slashes. On this button to establish a connection. So if GUI layout dot button, and we'll put in the button the word connect, and we'll set the height to GUI layout dot height, and I'll just use 25 pixels as the height, 25, and we close all the brackets, and then within that block of code, and we'll now write the block of code for that if statement. So the first thing that I want to do is to ensure that the player can't attempt to join the game, join our server, with an empty name. They need to type at least something as their name and then join the server, not just an empty string. So I write there a comment, ensure that the player can't join a game with an empty name. So if player name is empty, then player name is, whoops, we'll assign to player name variable player. So they get some sort of a default name when they join the game. Now after that, if the player has a name that isn't empty, then attempt to join the server. So if player name is not equal to an empty string, then let's execute the following code, which is to actually connect to a server. And I'll write the comment, connect to a server with the IP address contained in connect to IP, and with the port number contained in connection port. So that would be simply network.connect, which is that function there, network.connect, and it expects connect to IP. It expects the IP address, connect to IP, connection port, and then the port, connection port. And we'll also set player prefs. So we'll save the player's name. So that way when they've picked a name, they don't have to keep typing it every time they want to join a game. It'll be just saved, and we'll use the start function again to restore that name whenever they start the game. So player prefs dot set string, and the key is going to be called player name, and the variable that we're saving into the registry is player name, the string, and we'll just close that. Okay, I've finished the code for the connect button, so I'll do the next if statement. So for the next button, which is the go back button, first I'll just put a GUI layout.space, GUI layout.space, 5 units, or 5 pixels, and then I'll write if GUI layout dot button go back, and GUI layout.height 25 pixels, close off the if statement, and we'll simply say I want to connect to a server is equal to false, and that'll simply revert us back to the main window which has the 3 buttons on it. Okay, so I'll just save the code that we've typed so far. And let's also go back to our start function and load that string from the player prefs. The player's name is what we'll load. So we'll write the comment, load the last used, so something just like the comment above, load the last used player name from registry, and if the player name is blank, then just use the word player as a default name. So player name is equal to player prefs dot get string player name, the key that we had used. And now if the player name is empty, then we'll simply say that player name is player. Okay, and we'll just save that. So, looking at our connect window function, we have added the functionality for us to be able to connect to a server. So if we head back over to Unity, and before we build the game, well, we will be building and running the game because now we are going to try and connect to a server. So we'll use one of the game instances as the server, and we'll have another copy open and use that as a player and try to connect to the server. But before we do that, we need to set a property so that the windows will run in the background, so our games will run in the background. And the reason for that is otherwise when the server is minimized, it'll stop functioning. So while the server is minimized, no player will be able to connect to it, and there'll be no scripts running on the server. So we go to Edit, Project Settings, Player, and under Resolution and Presentation, check Run in Background. So we should be good to go now. So let's just go File, Build and Run. And when it runs, we'll play that. So hit play. And I won't use this one as a server. I'll use the Unity editor as the server. And the reason for that here, have a look. From the stats panel, we have a bit about network. No players connected, it tells us at the moment. So when we attempt to connect, we should see that change. So I'll just set up a server. I'll leave that name test server. So you can see it's loaded the name up. Start my own server. Now go back to that other copy and connect to server. I could change the name of the player. Yeah, why not? I'll just call it test player. And that's the IP address is the right one. It's local, it's our own computer. And the port number, I'll leave it alone. That's the same port number as the server. And hit connect. Okay, so we don't see anything on the players window because we haven't implemented any spawn system or anything like that, so the player would get spawned, and we'll come to that later in the next video about spawning players and making them suited for multiplayer. So at the moment it just looks empty, but we have actually connected to the server, so I'll just minimize that. And you can see here network player 0, and it's telling us about bytes sent and received. So we know that there is a player connected, because before it said no network players. So if I just shut this window down, you can see there it's changed now. Network, no players connected. So we know that we are able to set up a server, and we know that we can connect to this server. So we've done this step now, which is allowing us to connect to a server. The next thing we really need to do, we need to move on to the next steps where we actually set up the disconnect windows so that we can actually disconnect from a server or shut down a server if we're running one. So I'll stop playing and I'll just save the scene and move on. We're on to step 4 of 6, which is to set up the shutdown window for the server. I've just brought us back to this slide so that we could remind ourselves of what the server shutdown window looks like. And it's just a small window that'll sit in the top left corner of the screen, and it'll allow the server manager to see how many players are connected and be able to just shut down the server. So this window will appear while the game instance is a server. So let's go on to write code. So we'll go back to our multiplayer script. Okay, we're back in our multiplayer script, and the first thing we'll do is to add a couple more variables, and these variables will be for the server shutdown window. So the comment, these variables are used to define the server shutdown window. So private rect server dis window rect, so stands for the server disconnect window rect. Private int server dis window width, and that's equal to 300 pixels. Private int server this window height is equal to 150. Private int server this window left indent, and that'll be 10. So private int server this window top indent. I'll just remove the capital I there. Is also 10. Okay, so we've done our variables. I'll just save that. And next, we'll add a new function called server disconnect window. So let's scroll down, and before the onGUI function, I'll place it before it. You could place it anywhere, but I've just chosen to put it here. So void server disconnect window int window ID GUI layout dot label. So then I'll put in there the string server name, the colon, put just a space, and then a closing quotation mark, and plus, so add to that string the server name. So that's how we'll get the label at the top that tells us the server name. So it'll say server name colon, there'll be a little bit of a gap, and then we'll see the server name. And next we'll show the number of players connected. So I'll just write a comment there. Show the number of players connected. GUI layout dot label number, so in quotation marks, number of players connected colon space end quotation plus network dot connections dot length. So this will tell us network dot connections dot length is the number of players connected to the server. And after that, we show the player the server administrator, who might also be a player. We show them the ping. So, and we do that while there is at least more than one player. So it's the average ping for the network connection. So in my comments, I'm writing if there is at least one connection, then show the average ping. So now the code itself, if network.connections.length is greater than or equal to 1, close that brackets, parentheses, GUI layout dot label quotations ping colon a space end the quotation plus network dot get average ping network dot connections 0. All right, and then we had our button below that, which allows the player to disconnect from the server. So another comment, shut down the server if the user clicks on the disconnect or shut down server button. So if GUI layout dot button and give it the content disconnect, or no, let's just put it shut down server. I just need to put one more bracket there, and then within that if statement, so if the player does click on that, then just simply do network dot disconnect, and that will shut the server down. So we're not done. So we've now set up the code for our server disconnect window function. Now we need on GUI to run that function when we have a server running. So just like we had here a case with network peer type dot disconnected, now we'll use network peer type dot server. So underneath, add another if statement in our on GUI function. So I'll place the comment: if the game is running as a server, then run the shutdown server function, no, server disconnect window function. Server disconnect window function. And then we'll just simply say if network.peerType is network peerType.server, then we'll define the rect for that window. So I'll just put the comment defining the rect for the server's disconnect window. And then simply the code server this window rect is equal to a new rect. So server this window left indent, and then for the top, server this window top indent. I'll bring it down to the next line. Then we have server this window width and server this window height. And that defines the rect. Also, I've forgotten to put a comma there. So now we can go over to the next line. And we'll make that window appear now. So server this window rect is equal to GUI layout dot window. Just give it an ID of 1, something different from the main window. Server this window rect now. That's the rect of it. And the function server disconnect window. There we go. That's the function. And for the header, for that bar at the top, I won't have anything written there, so I'll just put an empty string and close that. Alright. So if we save our code and go back to Unity, it should be working now. So let's go over. And we're being warned about a possible mistaken empty statement. So let's have a look at what that was. And yes, it's highlighted me to a mistake I've made, and that is in this if statement right here for that the button to shut down the server. I've accidentally put a semicolon there that I shouldn't have. So I'll just remove that and I'll save it and go back to Unity. And let's see, does it disappear? Yes, it's gone. So let's give it a try. Alright, and I'll click on the Setup Server button and Start My Server. And yes, you can see that we have our window in the top left corner. No one is connected. You can see the name of the server. Let's click the Shut Down Server button. Okay, so we shut down our server and then we disconnected, so we can once again create a new server and shut the server down. So let's just try build and run and just see that we'll see the number of players. Play. And I'll set up a server. Start my server. Go back to this one. Connect to the server. Yes, okay, we can see that it is working. The ping appeared and the number of players connected appeared. So yes, it is working, and we'll move on to the next step now. I'll shut everything down here. And our next step is going to be to set up a disconnect window for the client, so for the player. We've moved on to step 5 of 6 now, which is to set up a disconnect window for the client, so for the player. And just a quick refresher, the client disconnect window is a small window that'll appear in the middle of the screen, and it allows the player to just disconnect from the server or return back to the game. And there are two labels. One of them shows the name of the server, and the other shows the ping of their connection. Now, the other thing about the client disconnect window is we'll also implement code so that the player can press the escape key to hide it, or they can press the escape key to bring it up in the first place. So let's move on to the multiplayer script and implement this functionality. Okay, we'll add a couple more variables, and this time, so these variables are used to define the client disconnect window. So these variables are used to define the client disconnect window. And so we start off with private rect client dis window rect. So it just stands for client disconnect window rect. Private int client dis window width. And I'll just get rid of that capital I, put a small one, which is equal to 300. Private int client dis window height equal to 170. Okay, and now we'll set up a new function just like we had for the server disconnect window. Now we'll create a new function for the client disconnect window. So void client disconnect window, and then an int in brackets, int window ID. And then in that we'll have the comment show the player the server they are connected to. So we're going to first show them a label showing the name of the server. So show the player the server they are connected to, and the average ping of their connection, and the average ping of their connection. So GUI layout dot label, and in brackets quotation mark connected to server, colon space end quotation plus server name. I'll just scroll down a bit. GUI layout dot label in quotations ping colon space and in that quotation plus network dot get average ping network dot connections inside brackets the square type 0 and then just close the curved brackets. So we're getting the average ping of this player. So they see their own average ping. And then a GUI layout.space and 7 pixels. Oops, just put a bit of a gap there. So now if the player clicks on that disconnect button, they'll then just disconnect from that server. So that's what we'll write next. So the player in our comments disconnects from the server when they press this button. Well, when they press the disconnect button. So if GUI layout dot button in quotation marks disconnect, so that's what will be written on the button. GUI layout dot height 25. So I'm just setting it manually. And what should be done when the player presses that button? Well, network.disconnect. And open and close brackets. And before we add code to the onGUI function, there are another 2 functions that we need to add. And these 2 functions are also Unity functions, so we're not making them up. Oh, sorry, we're not putting it inside that. So separately, outside of the client disconnect window function, set up a new function. So void on disconnected from server open close brackets and then have a parenthesis. So application. So what we're going to do when the player has done network.disconnect, we also want that their game should just reload and go back to the main screen. So what we're simply going to do is just do an application.load level and just load this current level that we're on. And by doing that, all the activity that the player had in their game, it'll just get all erased. So we'll implement that right now. So I'll put in the comment, if a player, because even if they lose a connection, we want the same thing to happen. If a player loses the connection or leaves the scene, then the level is restarted on their computer. And within that, we'll write one line, application.load level. It's this function here, .load level. Then in brackets, application dot loaded level. So that is the currently loaded level. So just reload it again. And then we'll add another function. So this one is void on player disconnected network player. So network player, and we'll just put in there our own little name for the variable, network player. So this function, when a player disconnects, this function will run on the server, and when a player disconnects, this function will receive the network player ID, and from that it'll know that it needs to remove the remote procedure call, so the RPCs, off that player and destroy any objects that were created by that player. I'll explain RPCs a bit later in this video because we will implement one. So I'll write the comment. When the player leaves the server, delete them across the network along with their RPCs so that other players no longer see them. Yes, because if we didn't do that, then when the players join, they send out, how it'll work is they'll send out an RPC, like this message, to all the other players that I've joined the game, so instantiate my player character in your games as well. And when the player disconnects, if we don't get rid of the RPCs, so we'd buffer that RPC so that new players joining the game would also see this player. If we didn't delete the RPCs, then even when this player is gone, when a new player joins the game, they'll see a ghost of the player in the game. So the player will be there just standing still exactly where they spawned, and the new player, let's say they're an enemy, they can shoot at that player, but obviously nothing's happening, and it'll be pretty confusing as to why is there this ghost player just standing in midair. So this is part of the reason why we're deleting the RPCs. So network, and we'll understand all that a bit more in the next video when we actually set up the spawn system for our players. So network dot remove RPCs, and whose RPCs to remove? The network, the very player who left, and we identify them by their network player ID. Network player, that's that variable that we had just made to hold that number. And I need to put the semicolon. And network dot destroy player objects network player. All right. Okay, let's save what we've done so far. So we have implemented 3 new functions. 2 of them are inbuilt ones from Unity itself. Now let's go over to our onGUI function and add the necessary code to draw the client disconnect window. So within onGUI, let's put in a new one. So first let me just put some comments there. So for our comment, if the connection type is a client, which is also a player, I'll just write that in black brackets, then show a window that allows them to disconnect from the server. And that is the client disconnect window. So if network.peerType is a network.peerType client, then execute the following code. So we'll define the rect for client disconnect window rect. So client this window rect is equal to a new rect. Now for the left side, we say screen.width divided by 2 minus client this window width, yes, divided by 2. So what will that do? It will, so for example, is we're trying to position it in the left side of the screen. And this is the left indent telling us about... Oh, sorry, we're not trying to position in the left side of the screen. We're trying to position it in the middle of the screen. So since we're trying to do that, we're just dividing the screen in half. So if it's 1600 pixels, we divide by 2, get 800 pixels. And the disconnect window width, what did we say it was? We said it was 300, so we divide that by 2. We get 150. So the 800 minus 150 would be 650, if I've done my math correctly there. And that would leave us the same amount on the right side. So that way we have an even spacing. So let me just find our function again. Yes, there's the onGUI. So yes, it will place it in the middle of the screen. And I'll just put a comma, go down to the next line. And now I'll do the top indent, which will be screen dot height divided by 2 minus client this window height divided by 2. Once again, I'll put a comma, go to the next line and define our width, which is client this window width, comma, client this window height. And that is our rect defined there. And put the semicolon. And now we'll actually draw that window. So client this window rect is equal to GUI layout dot window. I can use 1 since the server disconnect window and the client disconnect window are never ever going to appear at the same time. It's no problem. I can use the same window ID. But if I have 2 or more windows that are appearing at the same time, then they should all have different IDs. So I just put a 1 there. Client this window rect. And then the function client this connect window. And I don't want anything yet in the bar at the top of the window, so just an empty string. Close off that window and put the semicolon. And we will have now implemented the code necessary to show that client disconnect window in the middle of the screen, and for the player to be able to click on the button and disconnect from the server, and for the game to reload itself, so the level will reload. Now what we haven't implemented is any code to allow the player to press the escape key to show that window and press the escape key to hide that window. So we will come to that. Let's just see that our code works first. So let's save the script, head over to Unity, build and run. So file, build and run. Play, and while it's loading, I'll hit the play button here and set up a server. Okay, and I'll go over to our loaded game and connect to that server. Okay, so we have connected to the server, and it tells us the name of the server that we've connected to, which is test server. You can see our ping, and we can click on the disconnect button, so let's do that. And yes, we have actually disconnected from the server. So we can actually also... So what we need to do now is, instead of this window appearing in the middle of the screen as soon as the player connects, we don't want this window to be visible. It should only appear when the player presses the escape button. So that's what we'll implement next. So I'll stop playing, just shut it down, exit prototype, stop this, and go back to our script. So I'll add a new variable. So scroll all the way back up. And I guess just about there, I'll just say private bool show disconnect window is equal to false. We'll use this boolean to decide whether to display that window or to hide it. So now we'll scroll down to our client disconnect window function. So there we go, our client disconnect window function. So in it, at the end of it, we'll add a new line. We'll add that other button, the return to game button. So GUI layout dot space 5 small little gap, and by putting the return button, it's more than just being able to click on the button to return to the game. If we're building it as a web player, and if the player were to go full screen in the web player, then when they press the escape button, what's going to happen is they'd just escape from the full screen. So that means we'd need a button somewhere for them to be able to return to the game. And so this button also serves that purpose. So I'll just write that in a comment to remind us. So this button allows the player using a web player who has gone full screen to be able to return to the game. Well, not to return to the game, I guess more like to hide the window. So to be able to, oh, it is return to the game, because later on what we will do is when we have one of those windows open, we'll have the cursor unlock, and while the cursor is unlocked, the player will not be able to move or shoot. So it is actually in many ways return to the game. So to be able to return to the game. And just as a reminder, pressing escape in full screen. I'll just take that to the next line. Doesn't help, as that just exits full screen. And we'll write the code if GUI layout dot button return to game. I'll just put a capital T. So that's what will be written in the button. GUI layout dot height 25. I could have made a variable really to hold this height here, but I guess I've been lazy. And what should we do? We should set that boolean show disconnect window is equal to false. So when the player clicks on this button, this boolean will be set to false, and then the window will hide. So we need to add a little bit more code to make the window appear when this boolean is true. So head over to the onGUI function, and back here where we're checking the peer type and checking if it's client, we'll add another thing, and we'll say and show disconnect window, check that it's true. So now this code in onGUI will only function, so the client disconnect window will only show if it's a client, their connection type, and if the variable show disconnect window is true. Now we need to add another little bit more code. So we'll finally use our update function. So we go all the way back up. There we have our empty update function there. So in update, we'll say if input dot get key down, so that second one, get key down, brackets key code dot escape. So if the player presses the escape key, then show disconnect window is equal to not show disconnect window. So what that means is just simply set the state of the Boolean show disconnect window to the opposite of whatever it currently is. So if it's currently true, set it to false. If it's false, set it to true. And now actually, by the looks of it, our code should function. We should be able to hide and show that disconnect window on the player. So let's save our script and head back to Unity, to File, Build and Run. Hit play. And I'll set up a server. I'll connect to our server. And yes, the window has not appeared. We are connected. We can see on the server that there is a player connected. So let's press the escape key, see what happens. And yes, it appears. Let's press the escape key again. Yes, it disappears. Let's try pressing the return to game button. Yes, it disappears. And let's click the disconnect button, see that it works. Yep, it works. It reloaded the level. So I can connect to the server again. I'm connected. I can press the escape key and then it appears. So I know that it is working. So we have actually finished this step. Now the next step that we're going to work on is being able to allow the players to see the name of their server. So currently, because we're running it on our same computer, it's loading up the server name. But if some other player on a remote computer is connecting to you, we haven't actually implemented any code to allow them to see your server name. So in the next step, we'll actually implement an RPC, a message that'll get sent from the server to the player, telling them the name of the server. So let's move on. We've reached our last step, which is to allow players to see the name of the server. So let's go over to our multiplayer script. Okay, we're back at our multiplayer script, and what we're going to add at the end of it, we're going to add an RPC. So put a square bracket open, write RPC, and close it with the square bracket. And then we'll create a new function called void tell player server name string server name. And simply within it, I'll write server name. So the variable at the top, server name that we're using, which we had defined all the way back up here, server name, and that is used to show the name of the server in the player's disconnect window. So server name is equal to this server name here, the string server name. And I will write a comment up here just to explain what that's for. So it's used to tell the multiplayer script in connected players the server name. Yeah, otherwise players connecting wouldn't be able to see the name of the server, because they haven't been told by the server what it is. And what we'll do, we won't create another function, we'll write another function that's from Unity. So we'll just put it back up with these other two. So void on player connected network player with a small n, just like you see above for the on player disconnected. Now we have an on player connected, and the on player connected, just like the on player disconnected function, is one that runs on the server. So we'll add the code. So when a player connects to the server will send an RPC to them. So network view, so as the very thing that's highlighted there, network view dot RPC. Then we write the name of that RPC, and the name of that RPC here is tell player server name. I'll copy and paste it so I don't make any mistakes. Close the quotation. And who is it being sent to? So we can choose to send it to an individual player by their network ID. We can also choose to send it to everybody, or to and to even players who have yet to connect as well by buffering. But in this case, we only want to send the message to the very player who's connecting. So we simply say we use this network player, that variable that we've used to store the ID of the player who's just connected. And now we wrote here, so for our RPC tell player server name, this function is expecting that it receives a string. So something needs to be given a string. So when the function is called, it also expects to be given something. So we're going to give it the string server name. And by the way, we can name this. See here how I've written string server name. We can name it whatever we want. So I'll put it here. But here, I'm telling that function what string I want it to take. And I want it to have server name. So that's it actually. So what'll happen is a player will connect to the server. The server's MultiplayerScript will execute this function because a player has connected. It knows their network ID. It'll run this RPC, and that RPC is tell player server name, and it will send the RPC to that player who's connected, and in the function we've supplied it with the server name string. So now when we come to the RPC, so it's telling the it's telling the player who's connected, it's telling their MultiplayerScript, okay, you run this function too, and I've been given that string server name, so you use that. And so then the server name variable will be equal to that supplied string. So what we've really sent here is we've sent the variable server name, that string of the name of the server, to the player, and we've also told the player to run this function on their script. So that way, so they've received the name of that server here, and they've been told to run this function, and by running it, they've set that variable server name all the way up here. They've given it something. So they've given it the server name. So now when the client disconnect window runs, let's head over to that. So when the client disconnect window runs, they will see the name of the server now. So it's quite simple. It takes a bit of time to get used to the concept of RPCs, but once you get used to it, it's really quite simple. Well, maybe not necessarily simple, but it's logical. So I'll save that. And I'll head back to Unity, but we can't just build and run the game just yet. Now, in order to send RPCs, we need to attach a network view component. So go to Component, Miscellaneous, select Network View. This is what will allow our game object to be updated across the network. And we don't want it to continuously synchronize itself across the network. That's not necessary. So I'll turn that to off. And we don't need it to observe anything. So if, say, for example, we had the synchronization on and it was observing, say, this cube, and if that cube was moved on, say, the player, then by it being moved on the player, because it's synchronized, it will tell all the other game instances, including the server, that this cube is moving, so it'll move in their games as well. But we don't need that kind of constant update. We're just using an RPC, so we'll set it to none. So when you're just sending an RPC, you don't need to have synchronization or to observe anything. You just need a network view attached, that's all. So I'll save the scene, and I'll build and run. And if all is okay, it should work. Now, truly, I think the only way we'd know that it's working is by using another computer that's remote to this one, because let me try it. I think if I change this one's name, it doesn't matter. It's just going to get loaded from... No, actually, no, it won't. So yes, if I change this name, it'll have been saved to the registry. So let me just create a server. Because I've already loaded this, the name from registry that's been called up is test server. So I know that now, and I'm going to use this as the client. So I know that the server name will be test server. So I'll just go back. So let's set up a new server and let's change the name to my server. And let's start the server. Now let's go back to our game and let's connect to a server. And our player name, I'll just call it test player. Let's connect. So we're connected. Let's press escape. And yes, the RPC has worked. We can see that the name is my server. So as I was just explaining before, when I had launched this, when I had run and built this game here, this window, when it had launched, it did go to the registry and it pulled up the server name key. It checked and pulled it up and made server name variable equal to, and what I had called it before, it was test server. But when I created the game, I created a server here, I changed the name. And when the player then connected to that server, a message, the RPC was sent from the server to the client, telling them that the name of the server is my server, and that's what got displayed. So I can disconnect now. And let's exit. So we have actually finished this video. It was really a huge video. It's actually gone on for quite a bit longer than I was originally anticipating. So I do apologize if it was pretty exhausting, because I'm actually quite tired after recording it. And, well, in conclusion, what we have achieved at the end of this video is we've set up the foundation for our multiplayer system. So at the moment, it's nothing exciting looking. We don't see anything on the screen really except some windows. In the next video, we're going to start setting up our spawn system and configuring our player for multiplayer so that we can actually join a game and be spawned into the game. And since this video was so long, we can also expect that the next video is also going to be another massive video. So thank you for watching, and I hope you enjoyed this. See you in the next video.